Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Adam Forbes. Today I'll be talking about transitional forestry. It's a topic I did a PhD on and spent the best part of 10 years thinking quite hard about. So what I'm going to be going through, I'll talk about what are forest transitions, what are we actually talking about. I'll touch on some of the contentions that we've seen in the last few years, some of the applications, and I'll go through some critical context for this topic, which I think is really important for us to be thinking about, and I'll touch on the way forward and what we're doing with research. So what are we talking about? We're talking about exotic canopies, which might be existing, or more recently they might be planted, and the aim is to transition to some form of native dominance over time. This topic sort of centres on the nurse crop concept, so the canopy provides shelter and shade, and often it helps suppress light-demanding weeds, and it can get the forest regeneration function working in some instances. Now the photo up on the right there, that's probably one of the most convincing signs I've had of this, where an invasive willow with some experimental treatments, actually what was establishing were old growth species in really high density. So this is a convincing example of how an exotic stand can be managed to attain native dominance over time. It's worth thinking about, what are the attributes of a good nurse species, because it's very easy just to jump to, to choose a species without thinking too hard about it. I mean, we've heard about gorse a little bit today already, and in some circumstances it's actually not a bad nurse in that it's fast growing, light demanding, short lived. It can exit the succession on its own. It doesn't, that's not a long lived species, and it's not terribly tall. So have a think about some of the attributes of different nurse species and how they help foster regeneration. Some considerations, this is a really big topic, but some things to be thinking about. These forests or these stands, they don't have an intrinsic source of seed, so they're very dependent on the ability of species to arrive. And that's why we tend to think about seed source proximity, perhaps also the soil seed bank, depending on land use history. The macroclimate, the outcomes for regeneration, just as with any other form of regeneration, will be very different depending on where you are in the country, okay? And it's naive to think that that will be uniform or reliable everywhere. So there's a bunch of considerations here that are just really me getting some ideas down. If we go into a forest and to investigate it and to look at what's going on in terms of a transition, there's some key things that we can look at as a source of evidence to see how comfortable we are, and also what sort of management might be needed, how viable the transition actually is, full stop. So the compositional succession over time in forests, we get changes of species, we get a succession of species through time. And ideally, we really need a succession to tall forest, like Fiona Carswell's talk today. It's about a progression towards those more stable forests, those forests that can be self-sustaining. If we are stuck with species right over on this side, we're not really in a very good place in terms of a transition, because we don't have species that are capable of forming an independent canopy and supporting forest long term. So that's composition. Another thing we can look at is structure. So what's happening? Is there structural development? If we've got vertical structure, what's the cover of those species like? And like there's a stand in Golden Bay that I was working on with some others, and there were quite high native seedling densities, native woody seedling densities in the eucalyptus stand were about 3,500 stems per hectare, which is pretty good. We plant natives at about 2,500, right? So that's not a bad density, but very little cover. So part of the structural pitch is good, but another part isn't very convincing in terms of a progression towards native dominance. And this is where we need to think about management. Why is there little cover? What could we do? Could we increase light levels or reduce herbivory? Probably the most convincing example I've seen is this one, which I studied back in 2015. And it was a very sickly Pinus ponderosa stand in the central North Island up on the Kaingaroa Plateau. It was a Forest Service trial, and the folks then planted native conifers in a trial and sort of monocultural stands. And 50 years on, Rimu in particular had grown very well for a few reasons, I think, in particular the soils. But the scale carbon stocks for Rimu were greater than the sickly pines or for the other two conifer species. So when planting, this choice of species can really make a huge difference, is one of the conclusions I took from that study. So contentions, gosh, we've seen a lot of contentions over the last few years. A lot of this is centred around carbon forestry and large-scale plantings of usually Pinus radiata. And there's been strong arguments for and against it, essentially, and it's been strongly incentivised through the ETS. Now, at the scales I've seen it, in terms of, say, 60,000 hectares by one company alone, with no real intention to manage, it's deeply concerning, quite frankly. And so I wrote some guidelines with the help of a colleague, and one of the things we said there was that transition should only be attempted at scales that are reasonably manageable, because these are experimental forests and people need the ability to be able to manage them, otherwise the wheels could potentially come off. And that's obviously a problem. And so this plot here, I was in this forest 2 weeks ago. This is in the central North Island. There's a vegetation plot here. What you can see, there's some bush ricegrass and there's some tree ferns. Those are the only species that haven't been eaten in this forest understory. 2 deer ran past in the background as we were in this plot. Now, when we both arrived, we thought, oh, this is not going to take long to do the survey. Gosh, there's hardly anything here. But in actual fact, when we really got down on our hands and knees and searched in amongst the ricegrass and things, we found 12 native woody species. Now, this is a site that's quite close to native forest at about 500 metres above sea level. Pretty good context for regeneration. It's part of the reason I was there. I was quite excited about going to this one. Stem density of 3,100 stems per hectare. It's pretty good. But where are they? Like, seriously, I can't see them. Canopy cover below 2 metres, so if you look at the native woody canopy cover below 2 metres, less than 1%. Sort of speaks for itself. The forest was just absolutely just devastated by deer, essentially. And my point is that management is fundamental and inescapable to be successful with this. It's not even really a thing that's unique to transitional forestry. It also goes for other forms of native restoration. These threats are all the same. And I think the one thing I'd like to say to this conference is that we can talk about native forests in many ways, but fundamentally we have to get the management right if we're going to be successful, particularly at scale and particularly at achieving healthy, diverse forests. And we're not doing that right now. We've got some really unhealthy forests out here. This is one. For trees to support biodiversity and to store carbon, they actually need to have leaves, And my colleague, my assistant, who's really good, she said, how much photosynthesis would this tree be doing? The other thing is, it's also about the people involved, and because this is a forestry company and they have a business, there's a native gully over the back which is privately owned, and there are farmers. There's deer roaming everywhere, and we need somehow to address that issue. We came across people on hunting permits in this forest who feel very strongly about the ability to go and hunt. Some of them are dependent on the protein to put on their kitchen table. This is a really big topic, and we really need to get onto it now. This is something that I'm really concerned about. And until we're on top of this sort of thing, there's major limitations on attempting this, quite frankly. Applications for transitional forestry. The last few years, it's been a lot about carbon storage, and that's one thing. There's also some other interesting things that we could be thinking about here. Soil conservation. This pine stand is not allowed to be harvested by consent. So we've got a pine plantation in a sensitive catchment. The consent says we're not allowed to harvest it, so what do we do? There's a genuine application there for transitioning. repurposing existing plantations. This is a stand in the Central North Island, Marion stand. It's come back to them through a treaty settlement. They are aware of the horrendous weed issues in this area because they're tackling it elsewhere close by. And one way of achieving native cover here without having to go back to scratch in a clearfell and have a big battle with broom and a blackberry is to nurture the microclimate and gently transition it with management interventions. So I think that's another really valuable opportunity that people could be thinking about. The last few years, this is the critical context discussion. If you thought I was stroppy in the earlier section, this is where I get really stroppy. The critical context is, like, I spend a lot of time talking with people and thinking about this. There's just so much focus on carbon and climate change with forests. And while I understand that, I think we're forgetting a few things, quite frankly. I have referred to the large scale, like the really large scale Pinus radiata planting as a runaway train, because there's no way one company can manage so much land and have great regeneration. It's unrealistic, and it's really worrying because we need to have permanent forests. So what I've learned is if we focus on carbon, we end up with really siloed thinking and really siloed outcomes, i.e. landscapes being covered in one species because it's really good at achieving that single objective. Let's go back 25 years to the New Zealand State of the Environment Report 1997, where the government declared that biodiversity decline was New Zealand's most pervasive environmental issue. And this was due to loss of habitat in lowland areas in particular. We need to be remembering this. I feel we've forgotten this. I feel it's slipped off the table. We're focusing on carbon and we're focusing on climate change when it comes to forestry. That's how I feel about it. We've got indicators of ongoing biodiversity decline, even 25 years after that report, here's one indicator of biodiversity decline, the ongoing loss of native cover nationally. Internationally, this is what the UN is saying to us. The UN have declared the decade on ecosystem restoration, and the Sustainable Development Goals are indicating that this is our last decade to avoid catastrophic climate change, and to do that, we need to be involving biodiversity. It's inescapable. We have to be doing these things together, and I really feel that we need to look at this critically in this context when we're establishing exotic trees for restoration for permanent forestry. I feel that filling our landscapes with monocultural permanent pine forests is inconsistent with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and it's not going to help us stem our ongoing decline in biodiversity. We need to be much more diligent and well-reasoned in how we address it, such as coming back to the underlying management. There's some fundamental things that have to be in place for this to be workable, especially at large scales. So it's not that I believe in I certainly don't want to promote a native exotic dichotomy. I don't think replacing one extreme with the other is the solution. I think we'll need a range of solutions which play to the strengths of the land and help people get from A to B in their native afforestation. In some cases that will involve exotic canopies, just as it has at Hinawai with gorse. It's a method of getting from A to B. We shouldn't reduce it down to particular things. It's not helpful. So really what I'm seeing is it's when people overdo it in terms of the scale and their capability to manage, that's when I think it becomes a problem. I think if transitional forestry was being limited to a few hundred hectares per party across the country, we probably wouldn't even be talking about it right now. It would just be something that's interesting going on. So it's really that scale and the heavily incentivised nature of achieving single objectives which is concerning me. So, what we're doing about it. I finished my PhD in 2015, and there's about 7 years of no work, of no real research, a couple of failed research proposals, which has been quite frustrating, particularly given recently seeing the momentum going behind this. But things have changed. We've got some research funding and collaborations. And what I think we really need to look at with this is, there's a few things, I can't really go through it all, but we need to look at actually what's happening out there, and along climate gradients, along forest seed source availability gradients, look at the actual effects of herbivory, look at mature stands and what's actually happening in those understories, but do it in a way that we can kind of understand the drivers. And we have done very little of that work. We need to do that in a way where we can identify management thresholds. When are we actually comfortable that there's adequate regeneration in a plantation? What does that look like? Is it a stem density? Is it a percentage cover? Is it some sort of element of species richness? So we need to really, well, we actually have to do this because the forests, many of them have already been established, and we're going to need to know how to manage them. So there's some real work to be done there, not to mention sort of modelling work and wrapping it up into best management guidelines. I'd also like to set up some permanent trials, which were points of reference for people to look at, sort of at a management scale, transitioning exotic stands. So that'll be something else that I'll focus on. There are some collaborators which I wish to acknowledge. The National Science Challenge in particular, I've already started work with them in conjunction with Ag First, which is really great. And we have produced a little bit of guidance which is available on the MPI website, on the Canopy website. And that's about it for me.